Okay. That's the...
And good afternoon. We have a really, really special guest for the next half an hour. And don't touch that dial. We want you to listen and to hear everything that he has to say. It will be informative and enriching to all of us. Many of you will know this name, Steve Rapp. A whole lot of people know that name here in this area. And now, of course, he is a gentleman of the world, traveling all over the place. And he is an ambassador. Steve, welcome. It is so wonderful that you would take time to actually come to KBBG. Of course, you and Dolly have always been a supporter of the station. But this is an opportunity that we all, as a community and as students and children, can learn from you, because I really don't think a lot of us understand what goes on, what the UN means, probably for a lot of us, like nothing in our everyday life, you know. But it's a good idea, it's a start, and I feel like a mother. I don't know if I'm old enough to be your mother, but anyway, I am
No,
so
you
proud.
are not.
I am so proud of you. I really am. You guys have just done such a great, great job with your kids and everything. So we want to use this opportunity to have you tell us what you would like for us to know. If it's about the UN, what that really means. We don't get excited about that unless something terrible is going on. But certainly, as an ambassador and your travels around the world, and also your wife and your children going all over the place. So what an opportunity it's been for everybody, but I can't think of a single person that would be more deserving than you.
Well, thank you very much, Liv. It's great to be back here. I remember all those years working here at the station, coming on and doing sort of the People's Law and answering questions.
Yes, you remember that.
Your legal answer man, Mr. Rapp here, you know,
Exactly.
and so answering questions that people had when I was practicing law here
That's right.
in Waterloo, which I did, you know, full time through 1993 when I was appointed by President Clinton as U.S. Attorney for Northern Iowa. Of course, continue to live in Waterloo, and we still live in the Highland area, 219 Highland. And Dolly's a professor at UNI, and
Yes.
so I'm back here. But the current job don't get enough opportunity to be back. But when I was U.S. Attorney, I lived in Waterloo and drove down to Cedar Rapids every day, or sometimes out to Sioux City, where our other office was, and spent a lot of time in the community and working on public safety and equal justice kinds of issues. And that was a great job for 8 years. And then in 2001, I decided to make the jump to the international level, and I've been reaching out and talking to different people about how to become involved as a prosecutor in the international courts that the United Nations had created because of the horrible crimes that have been committed in the former Yugoslavia, where more than 100,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered, not just by shells and mistakes, but intentionally, murdering and raping people in order to drive them off because they were a different religion or a different nationality. And then, of course, that court was established in 93 and kind of got up and running in about 95, 96. And then the following year, there were the horrible atrocities in Rwanda.
Yes.
800,000 people murdered in only 100 days. And the UN established a court for that. And Dolly, as you know, teaches African history, and we even visited in Tanzania, where that court was set up, in Arusha, northern Tanzania, which is a very great part of Tanzania, which is right near Mount Kilimanjaro and the game parks, the famous Serengeti. And I was urged to seek to go to that court, not to the one in the Netherlands, but to go live in Africa. And so in May of 2001, I got a job, not as the boss there, but as a senior trial attorney that was in charge of one of the major trials that was then already started. But it involved, and here we are in a radio station, but it involved the famous radio station, radio television, Livre de Mille Collines, which basically it wasn't a television station, it was a radio for the Thousand Hills of Rwanda, the Mille Collines in French. And this radio station was controlled by the extremists and used as a way to build up hate against the Tutsis, to say that this group that had been traditionally powerful there, who 40 years beforehand had been kind of overthrown, and now those that had left the country were trying to come back, were basically saying we can't live with them. You know, they're so oppressive, they're so horrible that they'll put us back into bondage, and really built up the hate that people, even though, you know, about 500,000 had left the country, there were still 1 million in the country, about 15% of the population, built up this hatred, and of course this was happening at the same time that the extremists were arming young thugs as a militia, and the military was involved, and others were involved, and when the plane was shot down, they blamed that on the Tutsis and began killings, which were truly horrendous. I mean, people who were gathered in churches thinking they'd be safe. You know, they thought they were initially safe. There'd be a perimeter put around them, and then the killers would arrive and start hacking everybody to death with machetes and with clubs with nails in them, slamming the heads of children against the brick walls of the churches. And but you know, not a case of people. You know, sometimes people have an attitude in Africa that this is some kind of tribal violence. You know, it wasn't that. It was what it was is the leaders were afraid that they were going to lose their power, lose their positions, lose their wealth. So they incited people to focus their hatred, their concern, not on the leaders that were stealing, but on somebody else. And,
Yes.
and, you know, that's happened in Europe with the Jews, and you know, people say they're the problem. They're stealing our money. They're vicious. They're Christ killers. They deserve to die. You know, etc. And you know, meanwhile, the people that are giving that rhetoric are controlling everything and having everything their way. And they use these kinds of techniques to turn people against each other. And then when you end up sometimes in an armed conflict with a civil war, as they had there, it's possible to move it to the step where you have mass slaughter. So the UN, in response to that, not having done enough to stop it, not having really intervened, people didn't want to go in there, particularly after what happened in Somalia with Black Hawk Down, people didn't want to intervene, lose American soldiers or European soldiers, and so even though there was a very brave Canadian general, he had only 300 UN peacekeepers. He managed maybe to save about 30,000 people, but to witness the mass slaughter. But afterwards, and when the rebel army, that was actually the Tutsi army, took over the country and beat the genocidaires, they took over a country in which their mothers and brothers and sisters and sons were dead.
Yes.
And have basically been in control of the country since then. But the leaders, the prime minister, the military leaders, the media leaders, even some clergy who were involved in this, escaped the country. They used their wealth to chase off to 26 different countries, from the US to Canada to various countries in Europe and Africa. And an international court was established that then investigated, determined who was responsible, and began to issue arrest warrants. And because it was a UN court and it was established by the Security Council, it had the power to order countries to turn these people over. And sometimes that doesn't work. In this case, the whole world thought this was outrageous, so everybody cooperated, and eventually the court, having indicted 92 people, has brought 83 of them to justice. And so when I arrived, I was dealing with 3 people that had been arrested, 2 that had been head of the radio station, one of whom had been a powerful intellectual with a degree in Paris and everything else, a very distinguished man, but almost like Dr. Goebbels in the Nazi government. It was the sort of the ideologue of this sort of racial campaign. And another person was a key political leader that had been involved in the radio station, and a newspaper editor that had horrible, hateful editorials and cartoons that frankly incited people to rape, and it was incredible. So we tried those individuals and in the end convicted them, and they were the first people in the history of the world ever convicted for genocide or for incitement to genocide through the mass media. And those convictions were upheld on appeal. But later it was promoted by the African prosecutor, Judge Jallo from Gambia, appointed me as chief of prosecutions, and I was in charge of all of the cases then, the military leaders and political leaders. In the end, this court, which is now concluding its work, has basically moved forward with, I think, 83 different individuals out of the 92 that had arrested. There are a few fugitives left. But I left there at the end of 2006 and was appointed by Kofi Annan as the then chief prosecutor over in West Africa, in Freetown, of the special court that had been established by the UN in partnership with the country of Sierra Leone, that had gone through this horrific civil war. And it wasn't, in this case, a religious or ethnic kind of conflict. It was, frankly, some people who were greedy for the diamonds, who basically started a rebel group, said they were going to bring a better government, but every time they took over a town, they treated people horribly. Because their way of recruiting was basically to attack a village, kill people, intimidate everybody to the point that they would comply with whatever orders they gave. And one of the more vicious things they did was to drag people forward and chop off hands, you know, offering people the choice between short sleeves and long sleeves. And kidnap the women and make them into sex slaves. And kidnap the children and turn them into soldiers, you know, 11, 12-year-olds. Yes. Tell them that they're Rambo and give them, you know, drugs mixed with gunpowder and guns and sometimes I remember dealing with one young guy who was called Dr. Chop Chop, who was 12 years old, and he became proficient in chopping off the hands of adults. But I mean, you know, it wasn't his fault. I mean, he was basically, he was doing things that adults wouldn't do because he hadn't really, you know, developed morally like an adult does, and this was a way in which they could keep this kind of this so-called revolution going. Eventually, they were defeated, but the government asked for a court to try those that bore the greatest responsibility, and so my predecessors indicted a number of leaders of the various militias and developed evidence that the man really behind the RUF was Charles Taylor, the president of Liberia next door. And so he was indicted, and eventually, I mean, he was overthrown in his own country, and went into exile in Nigeria, and after President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected in Liberia, she asked Nigeria to turn him over to Liberia, and Liberia then sent him on to the Special Court for Sierra Leone to be tried. All of our trials that we conducted were in Freetown in West Africa, on the coast there. It's a beautiful country, a very poor country. But in the case of Taylor, the local leaders said, we really are afraid to try him here. There could be efforts to break him out. And so they asked that that trial be moved. And so we made arrangements with the International Criminal Court in The Hague to try him. And I opened that trial in July of 2007. And continued it through the through the prosecution case. These cases are very complicated. It's not like a case that I handled in Cedar Rapids, a bank robbery or something that was over in 10 minutes. Right. You had to lay out what had happened over the course of 10 years. I mean, Taylor would say, well, I was in touch with the RUF, but I was in touch with them to help to make peace, you know, et cetera. And you'd have to lay out what the reality was. And of course, he was very ably represented in this trial. Pick holes where we could in the evidence, and so it's you know, and when you're talking about historical events, there's always different ways to look at it. And so these are not easy cases, and also there weren't orders, written orders and documents that involved turning 20 or 30 of Taylor's closest people against him, including his vice president, the guy who succeeded him as president. I led his testimony in The Hague. We concluded his testimony, we concluded the prosecution case and began the defense case, and then I had an opportunity to join the Obama administration. My successors have continued with the case, and it concluded last March, and the judgment actually on Charles Taylor will be announced in The Hague on the 26th of April of this month, and I'll be there.
Tell us what The Hague means. What
well, the Hague is
thing?
Yeah, the Hague is it means hedge because there are hedges there in Dutch, and it's a town in the Netherlands, south and west of Amsterdam, on the coast, and it's actually the royal capital where the Queen of the Netherlands lived, and it's a beautiful old city. The Hague became famous as the center of international justice when before even World War I, an international court of arbitration was established there, and after World War II, the International Court of Justice was established. Now, the International Court of Justice, which is part of the UN system, has cases between countries. It doesn't try individuals. So if there's a dispute, as it was, say, between the United States and Mexico on death penalty and consular notification of Mexican citizens who were tried in the U.S., those cases, it becomes Mexico versus the U.S. and is tried before a court there. And that's what it continues to happen at The Hague in a grand palace built